Well, hello there, and welcome to another segment of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman at the Palm Springs Air Museum. And today we're going to talk about another very, very interesting Navy aircraft in World War II, and that is the Grumman, either the TBF or the TBM Avenger. As you can tell, I've got my hat today, which my jovial assistant, Greg, is picking out his own descriptor names now. He's also picking hats for me. So today I have my propeller head. I'm going to toss that off to him off camera. There we go. And we're going to get into it. Now, Grumman is one of the premier Navy manufacturers, naval manufacturers of aircraft in the world. And at this time, remember, they were learning. We talked about the Wildcat last segment. This is the Avenger. The same thing applies in that the TBF or the TBM, the designation depends on whether it was built by Grumman, which is the F, or the M, which is General Motors. And you remember that from last week with the Wildcat. This airplane behind me is in George Bush's colors, a former president of the United States. This is, and Greg, if you can get that, this is Barbara 3. Barbara 3, he flew off the San Jacinto. Barbara 2 is the aircraft that he got shot down in, and we're going to talk about that as he was attacking Chichijima a little bit later in the segment. But why don't we get into it? So this particular airplane is the heaviest single-engine aircraft that was manufactured during the war. Now, it's a little bit bigger than the P-47 and the Thunderbolt, and the P-47 was about 400 pounds lighter than this airplane. So this is a beast behind me. You can tell from the dimension how big it is compared to, let's say, that little Wildcat that we talked about last week. So let's walk around. We'll talk about the genesis of this airplane. So Greg, I'm going to walk over here and we're going to start talking about this Avenger. Now, this airplane joined the fleet in 1942. It had a 2,000-pound load capacity. That was a Mark 13 torpedo, a 2,000-pound bomb, or a different configuration. The crew set up in this airplane was you had a pilot, you had a bombardier, radio man, navigator, gunner that was in this area here, and gunner by, there was a machine gun. You can see it right there that was called actually a dorsal machine gun. I don't know if you can get that, Greg, at the bottom. He could shoot downward out of that. There was also an electrically operated turret in this airplane, and that was a gunner that actually sat in that turret. Early iterations of this airplane had a .30 caliber machine gun in the nose that was actually firing through the propeller, and then there was a single .50 caliber here and a .30 down below. These were upgraded to two .50s in the wings and the machine gun that was in the ball turret and the dorsal turret later. The aircraft actually first saw combat at Midway when 6 of these airplanes were actually involved in the Battle of Midway. Now, the Battle of Midway is interesting, and that is the turning point really in the Pacific. You could say in Europe, perhaps on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad was a turning point for the Germans. In the Pacific, the Japanese, suffering enormous casualties at Midway, was really the turning point where the Japanese saw their expansion begin to slow down. Remember, the Japanese and the Germans up to this point had been pretty much having their way with the Allies and appeared to be invincible. They were winning pretty much every time, and they were defeating the Allies at every turn. After Midway, the Japanese tried a few offensives in the Pacific, but primarily they were on the defensive, and there was a march back to Tokyo. So this is the configure of the airplane. The engine in this is an R2600. Something very interesting about this airplane on this wing system here in a minute, and I'm going to give you we're going to be filled with Fred fun facts today. So we're going to get into those Fred fun facts here. So why don't we get a shot next of this carrier. We talked about Midway to give you an idea about how poorly torpedo bombers did at Midway. Remember, they have it was either the Devastator or the Avenger. there were 42 out of 51 torpedo bombers shot down at Midway. So they were literally almost completely wiped out. And the Avenger kind of took on the role, which is the Devastator was obsolete and retired from service. The Avenger took over. Now, the Avenger flew off of all of the either Essex class and new fast attack carriers, the Independence classes, which is what we have here. This is the San Jacinto. This was actually the carrier that George Bush flew off of. This carrier here is an interesting one in that it shares something in common. We get a close-up of that, Greg. It shares something in common with the Lexington that we talked about last week. And for that, here comes first Fred's fun fact. I think this is a good time to do stage 2, Greg, don't you? I think we're going to do stage 2. Now, Greg is also picking out my stage 2. Today, I have Sarnac's Shirley Temple, a handcrafted soft drink. Sarnac Shirley Temple is no sponsor here, but we're going to do a stage 2. Now, the stage 2 is, we always tell you about how you get an interesting fact that you can amaze your friends and perhaps win a bar bet. Obviously, this is non-alcoholic, but the Independence class carriers, light carriers, and the Lexington class that we talked about last week share an interesting commonality. They're both built on warship hulls. This is built on a light cruiser hull. The Lexington was built on a battle cruiser hull, which was laid down prior to the Washington Treaty, but then converted to a carrier after that. So that's your fun fact. Now, people we are missing today, we're going to cheers our docents. We have about 325 docents at the museum. We miss you, so if you're at home, docents, cheer to you. Here's my stage 2. That's an interesting taste, Greg. I may keep this one with me. I actually like this one. We may walk around with this. This is a little sweet there, but cheers to our docents. We'll see you soon. So the San Jacinto was the aircraft carrier that Bush flew off of. He was famously shot down in an attack on Chichijima, which was an island chain in the Pacific. The aircraft was hit after he dropped his bomb. The other 2 crew members did not make it out of the airplane, and he ended up in the water. He was picked up by, and I'm going to show you this over here, Greg. I'm going to work to my left. He was picked up by one of the Gatto class submarines, and that's what we have here. When you come to the museum, we have all kinds of really neat ship models. We've shown some of these cutaways before. We're not going to get too deep into the into submarines because that's not what we're doing here today. But when you get into this cutaway here, you can see the engines, all the inner workings. This in here is a pressure hull. We have a lot of these cutaways on various ships. We have in the back of the Pacific hangar about 40 different ship models, everything from Imperial Japan, the United States, the British, the French. So when you get to the museum, check that stuff out. But these submarines were critical in picking up down flyers during the war, and George Bush was one of them. Who knew that he was going to be president of the United States? Now, the interesting thing about George Bush getting picked up by this sub was that the Japanese on Chichijima were also cannibals. And there were 8 airmen on Chichijima. Bush would have been the 9th. And the Japanese killed and ate some of the American airmen that were there. After the war, 4 of the Japanese officers and 30 of the enlisted men were charged for that. The 4 officers that were involved in that were all executed for war crimes after the war. All of the soldiers that were involved in that, Japanese soldiers, were released. It is an interesting turn of events with that, but had Bush been captured, likely he would not have survived the shoot-down, but he was picked up by one of those patrol submarines, and as we know, the rest is history. And we've already talked about Barbara, which was named after his wife that he put on all of his airplanes. This aircraft shows this gradient color scheme that we've talked about before. The Navy experimented with various color schemes and camouflage. You can see this goes white and goes gradient up from in stages of blue, and that was to kind of hide you, which was not, as I said, very effective when you had 50 or 60 aircraft attacking you at a time. Now, as a torpedo bomber, this is another weapon that has gone by the wayside. Torpedoes now are smart. They're acoustic, they're homing torpedoes, they're wire guided. We're not going to get too much into ordnance, but at this time, and Greg, maybe we can go back over to this ship model real quick so we can demonstrate. If you were an aircraft and you were coming in at a ship and you were going to drop a torpedo, in this case, this was the Mark 13 torpedo. This, you'd have to figure out where the ship was moving and drop your torpedo so that the torpedo would go through the water and intersect, hit the ship, and detonate. And that was all done with calculation. Some of them had fire solution, aircraft had fire solution computers into them. The subs definitely did. And later in the war, there were acoustic or homing torpedoes that would home in on the propeller sounds of the ship. But this was a really risky business. As I said, 90% of the torpedo bombers at Midway were shot down. 42 out of 51. 5 out of 6 Avengers that fought at Midway were lost, and the 6th one was shot up terribly, barely made it back. So you dropped your torpedo. In the case of the Avenger, that was a Mark 13 torpedo that you would drop. The torpedo would drop into the water. Some of those torpedoes would go down as deep as 50 feet, and you aficionados who are torpedo guys can tell me all about how that works. I'm not, but the torpedo would go in, it would start its run, and then it would go at the ship. The Mark 13 torpedo at the beginning of the war was not reliable at all. In fact, Navy studies indicated that 70% of the torpedoes that were dropped, the aerial torpedoes drops, failed. That meant that you had a 30% chance of, if you got the torpedo in the water, if you calculated the angle of deflection correctly, and if the torpedo hit the ship, 30% of the time it would detonate. It was not popular with either submariners or with airmen that were dropping them. They did not like the torpedo. The Navy kept working on that torpedo throughout the war and eventually got it to a point to where it actually worked fairly well. U.S. submarines sunk the predominant amount of shipping in the South China Sea, and American torpedoes obviously became better, but especially early in the war, they were incredibly unreliable. Now, the Avenger could also carry bombs. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and various ordnance, but those torpedoes were its primary weapon. Now, if you were, and we'll walk around over here because we've got some other interesting artifacts over here. We'll have Greg follow me. One of the things, if you are a Navy guy and you need one of these hats, if you're a Navy guy, go out to the web store and you can buy one of those things. And, you know, we have all kinds of stuff up there. We've put up the B-17 and other P-40. Go out to the web store and pick one of those up. Remember, we can also use your donations at the same time. So if you can help us with that, that'd be great. Now we're going to walk over to this table, and let's say that you were unlucky enough to get shot down in the case of George Bush and you ended up in the water. You could have a Mae West, and Greg, I'm going to walk out of frame here. I'm going to grab my stage 2 because I'm going to give you another Fred fun fact. The Mae West life jacket, who named that? Everybody thinks it was the Americans. It wasn't. The British are the first known use of the name of the Mae West life jacket, and that was the life jacket that you would end up with the water. Now, this is another extremely interesting artifact. This is an emergency radio transmitter. This is called a Gibson Girl. And a Gibson Girl transmitter was either in the aircraft and was part of your emergency gear if you had to get out, or it could be dropped to you if you were in your life raft. And this design is actually based on a German emergency radio system that the British captured, and they liked it so much that they copied it. And this had crystals in it. I'm not going to get in. You can look those up on Wikipedia. It was a crystal radio, but it worked automatically. You can see these pieces here. You actually put that between your legs, and then you would crank this, and it would generate 2 different emergency Morse code signals. It also had a Morse key on it that you could actually key out Morse code. Now, the interesting other piece of this was it came with, the emergency pack came with a hydrogen generator, which you had to be careful because you could get, you could fire that off and that would fill a hydrogen balloon, but you have to remember hydrogen in that kind of interaction generates heat, so you had to be careful you didn't burn yourself, but you could float up a balloon that would carry the antenna up, or you had this cool handy dandy kite that you could run out, and that would run the antenna out. This radio transmitter had an effective range of roughly about 300 miles an hour, or 300 miles out. And again, you aficionados at home can tell me, who are radio guys, can really get into the guts of this. But this thing saved a whole bunch of airmen, and it's one of the things, you know, that when we do all this stuff at the museum, you learn about all these things. I really never knew before at the museum that this existed and was as sophisticated as it was. But you did not need to be a radio operator. All you had to do is be able to crank this and figure out how to get the antenna deployed, and that would get you, hopefully get you rescued. Somebody would hear you and come and save you. All right, the other things we've got there are, in our survival pack, is our handy dandy mirror in case you were in the life raft and you need to do your hair, or you want to signal an aircraft, because you can do that. We had dye. I'm going to turn around here. We had dye, which was so they could see you from the air. We had shark repellent, because the last thing that you want to do is become fish food. And I don't know whether that stuff worked or not. There's always been a lot of interesting comments about shark repellent. You had a beacon light, a blinker light that in the water, and of course you had this this kite along with that balloon that you could deploy your antenna. So why don't we walk around here? We're going to get a look at the Bombay, and I've got my stage 2 here with me because I'm going to give you another Fred fun fact. We are packed with Fred fun facts today, so follow me around. Again, I'm about 6 feet tall, so you can get an idea of the size of this airplane. And Greg, I don't know if you can do this, but I'm going to actually get in here. You can see the size of this Bombay. The Mark 13 torpedo was about 13 and a half feet long. It was big. So you can see the size of this Bombay. A lot of Avengers after the war were used as firebombers and other things because they had this really, really big Bombay. But you can get an idea. I can stand up in here. I mean, it's huge. So let's back out. So I try not to bang my head as I get out of here. We have such tremendous production value. I've talked about this before. We spare no expense here. We're doing this. So you can see the characteristics of Navy aircraft: big, strong, wide stance gear. Here the Grumman hallmark as they learn more about the aircraft. And then I'm going to give you, as Greg follows me, my jovial assistant, another Fred fun fact. So are you ready? Get your stage 2 ready. This hinge is a unique hinge that was actually patented by Grumman. It is called the stow hinge. Now, you've seen some aircraft that are, when the wings fold up over the airplane like this. As you can see with when we did the wing swing on the Wildcat last week, and you could see this wing in the stowed position, which is why they call it the stow hinge, by the way. You can see the wing actually folds back and goes a long way along the fuselage. That is a requirement to save space. So when the hinge swings, they don't have to have the aircraft as far apart. And when the wings are in the stow, either when they come down as they fold down and out, or they come out, the radius isn't as wide and gives them more room on the aircraft carrier deck. This is a hinge that is unique to Grumman aircraft. It was designed by the Grumman after the engineers, and I've read where they talked about the this was designed after they looked at birds, and you know how birds have their wings along their bodies, very similar if you think about the way these airplanes are on the deck. So that is the overview and the walk around of the TBM or the TBF Avenger. I want to thank you for joining me today, and remember, hit that subscribe button, forward it to your friends. If you're on Facebook, hit the like button. There's a donation button down there and a gift shop button as well. We can use any of that money that you send us, and we got all this cool gear, so why not get geared up while you're sitting at home? My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Thank you very much. Here's my second shot of stage 2. Liquid sugar. Have a great day.